So thanks so much for that participation. I hope you met a couple of more people that you hadn't seen before. Slightly awkward in this space because I really can't see you. I'm kind of looking into the light, which might be a good thing. So my presentation is a pretty heavy title, Dynamic Whole Systems Design, How Can We Weave Ecosystems of Collaboration? And as you can imagine, I could easily talk about this for a couple of hours or a couple of days. So I'm just going to give you some snippets, a feeling for what I mean by this. We all know that we live in an extremely complex world, that we're facing a complexity that we might not be fully prepared for yet. And mathematically speaking, in the world of complexity, when you look into what that actually is, it's any system with more than 3 interacting variables is a complex dynamic system. And these systems are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable. So we have to learn to dance with this complexity and stop trying to control things. This slide is from a colleague of mine from the International Futures Forum, and it's from 2002, and if you can read, it's a bit of a small screen, but if you can read what's on these little arrows, these issues existed in 2002, and they're even more pressing now. I'm going to try to keep the bad news as short as possible, but I think it's summarized in those 4 slides, or those 4 images. Business as usual is no longer an option. The one in the top left corner comes from a paper from the Stockholm Resilience Center that was published in August. It's called something Climate Change in the Anthropocene. And basically it says that we're at a point where we've destabilized the global climate system to a degree that we're now in the beginning of what's called runaway climate change, where certain triggers in the climate system actually amplify the change, and where the possibility to move back will soon not be an option anymore. So we really, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has recently said that we've got 1.5 years as a global community to respond seriously to climate change. Otherwise, it might be too late. And then the graphic below that with all these rising exponential curves, they're basically all about water use, energy use, the amount of McDonald's restaurants in the world. Like basically everything is going up. If we don't make it on the tombstone of humanity, the words will be, this species didn't understand exponential growth. We just assume that things will go on more or less like we're accustomed to, but we're now in that steep end of the exponential curve, and things will change. Then the top right corner is Kate Raworth's donut, which is trying to put 2 things together. It's on the one hand the planetary boundaries, issues like climate change, ocean acidification, all the key parameters of the planetary life support system that we've already overstepped. And what's inside the circle, the red reaching into the circle, is where we don't meet the social foundations of building a healthy and viable society. So it's not just about environmental issues, it's about social issues as well. And that pyramid at the bottom is from a report that Credit Suisse gives out every 2 years. It's called the Global Wealth Report. And basically, we now live in a world where 8.6% of humanity hold 85% of the global wealth. 8.6% of humanity own 85.6% of the global wealth. But what's even more staggering is that 71% of humanity have to share 3% of the wealth. So again, business as usual is no longer an option. We cannot sustain a world that is that unequal, and would we want to sustain a world that is that unequal? So when I asked you about, are you keeping business as usual, or are you keeping the lights on? Are you a visionary? Are you an entrepreneur tweaking what is possible? This is to give you an embodied feeling of where you feel most aligned with this particular framework that, again, friends of mine in the International Futures Forum have developed. It's called the 3 Horizons Framework. And I encourage you, whatever you do, to look this up, because if you want to implement something in the long term and you need the voices of the practical day-to-day, you need the voices of the visionary in the room, and you need the voices of what can we do tomorrow, what is feasible already, then this is a wonderful map that, with a bunch of post-its, collecting ideas and working with it, you can actually step into that space. You could say that the red curve is business as usual, the world in crisis. The green curve is a viable future, tomorrow's land if we make it. And the blue curve is the entrepreneur building the bridge between the two. But most importantly, it's a way to value all these voices and all these perspectives on the future. Because if we want to build a future that works for all, we need to include everybody. The time of them against us is over. We're on living spaceship Earth. The ship is sinking, it's taking on water. Either we do it together, or there might not be a 22nd century with a lot of happy humans around. And the exercise that we did last with the cards is to introduce you to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's an imperfect platform, like most platforms that have been created. Like this particular one by the United Nations has come out of the largest consultatory process that the United Nations have ever engaged in. Over 1 million people from all the countries around the world have somehow contributed to this. A group of over 3,000 scientists and selected people have been working diligently on trying to make these goals the best they could. There are some critiques in the activist movement that, for example, goal number 8, which still names economic growth as a goal rather than as part of a dysfunctional economic system that we need to fundamentally transform, sabotages all the other ones. Yes, that might be true, so we need to reframe that economic growth to maybe qualitative growth. But rather than dismissing the SDGs altogether, I would invite you to understand them as a platform of conversation that for the first time is bringing supranational and national support to a local level, so you can actually have the conversation around how are these goals relevant to us here in Merseyside or wherever you come from, and how can we somewhat counter-co-opt them using the fact that they're now in national plans and there is international funding for implementation to make them meaningful to us. And I work part-time for an organization called Gaia Education, and I actually designed the cards that you were just using. And basically that's what they are. They are a facilitation tool where you can start conversations with people in your community around how to implement the SDGs in ways that are meaningful to your community. It comes together with a manual, which is called the Multipliers manual. We run a 1 day or a half, like there's 2 versions, a half day and a full day training called the Training of Multipliers. The manual details minute by minute a kind of facilitator script on how to run this workshop. So you can choose whether you want to first do one that Gaia Education offers somewhere in the world. You can bring them here and have them run one. But if you just want to run with it yourself, you just download the black and white version of the Multipliers handbook. And if you have any basic skills as a group facilitator and organizer, you'll see that it's very self-explanatory. So all you need is a set of these cards and you're off. And basically the different steps will show you, first they make people familiar with the SDGs, then they look at mapping what's already happening in my community that might not be framed under an SDG, but if I do a local water project on cleaning up polluted waters or giving people access to better drinking water, then that's already a project working on an SDG. And then you identify the low-hanging fruits in your community where you can do big changes, and then you identify where there's missing gaps. And in the bottom left corner is, some of you might be familiar with the business model canvas. Well, this is a kind of SDG version of the business model canvas. It's another step in a facilitation process where once people have identified a project that ideally addresses 3 or 4 of the SDGs together, because they have to be addressed together, then this step in the workshop helps you to deepen into that. And in general, Guy Education does a lot of capacity building all around the world. We have partners, over 100 partners in 52 countries around the world on all the continents bar Antarctica. And we have a face-to-face 125-hour course, which was initially called Eco-Village Design Education, but it's really about building sustainable communities. So it's also very relevant for people in a transition town movement or who just want to do neighborhood work. Then there's a 400-hour online course called Design for Sustainability. And if you're just at that point in your work where you feel actually everything has to be sustainable, because no matter what our future will bring, if we don't make it sustainable or regenerative, then it will not last into the distant future. But you feel you still need to brush up on a whole systems perspective of what that actually means. That course is a great opportunity to do so. And then we also run lots of project-based learning works in Bangladesh, in Senegal, in favelas in Brazil, where people apply this kind of whole systems thinking of sustainability. And the phrase that I've got there at the bottom is, it's really when you work in a systemic way, then you stop thinking, oh, that's my problem, how do I solve it? The first question is, give me at least 5 or 6 more problems. And then you look at, what kind of project can I build that would solve all of them at once? Because it's the siloed thinking, even in trying to create solutions to things, it's the siloed thinking that sometimes create the wrong emphasis in a project, and then that normally bites us in the back later in the process. So navigating this complexity is tricky. Unfortunately, I wasn't aware that the screen was going to be this small, so I'm fully aware that most people in the back rows will not be able to read all of what's on the slides. I will give the slides to Ruth, and Ruth will send them out to you. And there's lots of hyperlinks I'll give it as a PDF, and so all the resources you can directly follow up on. So don't worry about that bit. But what I'm trying to say with this slide is that I wrote this book called Designing Regenerative Cultures, and in many ways there's a paradox in this title, because cultures aren't designed. Cultures emerge through our relationships and our interactions with each other. But in these complex systems, once you accept that they are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable, and so the aim is not how do we manipulate it and force a particular future, then you can start look at what is it that I can do to make it more likely that the emergent property, the new part of this complex system that we can't predict, that suddenly pops up, will be positive rather than negative. And when you look deeply into this, you find that it is about building qualitative relationships, paying attention to what kind of information flows, who talks to whom, how deep those relationships are, and as you nourish these somewhat intangible parts of the system, so that's why education is so important, because the information that flows makes a big difference in the system. That will enable you to create a higher likelihood that what will emerge unpredictably is a healthier and a more positive system. And these images, again, unfortunately you can't read all of them, are just reminding you that we all sit, at the beginning of the slide there was the word global. It wasn't a misspelling. I'm actually talking about global, local at the same time. And whole systems design is about always being aware of the scale linking between your little project in your little neighborhood into the city and the city region and the nation, and how does it make a difference globally to implementing, for example, the SDGs. And so as a practice of a practitioner wanting to bring about change, this graph up there in the top right says you've got your project, and then you've got the primary whole, the place that you're in, and then you have the proximate whole, which is the slightly wider region. And one thing that is amazing in terms of making local projects more powerful is when you ask yourself the question, how does my local project contribute meaningfully in a positive way to that proximate greater whole? It will help you with funding, it will help you with the meaning for people in getting engaged in your local project. This comes from Pamela Mang, and there's actually, a book has this title, Regenerative Cultures. There's a whole movement around regenerative development, and the pioneers of that movement is a group called Regenesis Group, and they've created a whole training how to get engaged with regenerative development. So again, I'd encourage you to look into that. In summary to this slide, it's always understanding that since everything is interconnected, there's always constituent. If you think of your own body, there's cells that make up organs, that make up your body. You sit within a family, that sits within a community, within an ecosystem, within the planet. And health and wholeness has a scale linking quality. So if we work for a better world, we can work on any of these scales, and we should always be mindful of how our actions at any of those scales impact the other scales. Again, this is a set of, like the subtitle of my book, and the working title while I was writing it was actually Living the Questions Together. And for me, that's why on these cards that you played with earlier, there are lots of questions. Questions are enabling. They give people, like you're actually asking people to engage and to come together around a certain issue. If you just talk at them, they listen or they don't listen. But there's something really powerful in questions. And to my mind, one of the things that we've got wrong is that we always want to jump towards solutions and answers. Maybe a wise culture in the future would give a catalog of questions to the next generation rather than the answers. Because if you think of it, most of today's problems were yesterday's solutions. So how could we assume that all our most well-meaning solutions that we're working on today are not going to turn into problems for the next generation? So, and again, an invitation to be mindful of the power of questions. And these questions, won't run through all of them, are a distillation of having looked at what normally goes wrong when we work with complex systems. We do things like we set the wrong goals, or we try to just look at one isolated parameter rather than optimizing the system of the whole. So the most classic example is that we've built a global economy and national economies that measure everything in GDP. And GDP is actually not an inadequate, it's an inadequate measure of progress. When you fight a war, when you have a national catastrophe, GDP goes up. So we need better indicators of progress, and we need to make sure that when we work with systems that we try to optimize the system as a whole rather than just work with isolated parts. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but again, I would really encourage you to look at the PDF when you get it. Another aspect that is about the key things that motivate us to actually become active, to step into this small actions can make a big difference attitude, is to understand that we've been told an erroneous story about what life is all about. Somehow it has crept in that life is all about scarce resources and survival of the fittest and competition and some winners and some losers. This is how we set up our storytelling, and our storytelling is powerful. It creates the world we think we live in. we actually bring forth a world in conversation. And I'm originally trained as a biologist, and I can tell you that the way evolution works since the beginning is it is a process of diversification and subsequent reintegration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity. And this reintegration happens more often than not through collaboration and not through competition. So while there is a little bit of competition in the world, we've seen the nature programs where we see the lion kill the gnu. That's like ripples on the surface. It's like standing in front of the ocean and being distracted by the waves so much that you can't see the water underneath. But really, life is all about a sea of symbiosis and working together in collaboration. And if we reconnect to that, then we can refit in, because we are part of nature. That's another very dangerous bit of storytelling. Whenever you hear yourself or others use language in a way where you have kind of culture there and nature here, remind yourself and others that culture is an epiphenomenon of nature. We are first and foremost biological beings, and so we're part of this movement of diversification and subsequent reintegration of diversity at higher levels of complexity. And really that's what we're called for as a species right now. With all the converging crises we're facing, if we don't address them as one humanity and redesign the human presence on Earth within the lifetime of the generations alive today, then the Earth will continue, but probably we will have forced the climate system and all sorts of other issues around the planet to a point where the life support system will not support higher life forms like human beings. So we will have a greatly impoverished planet without us. But we're a young, immature species facing a rite of passage and an opportunity to grow up as a species and make a difference. And I feel like everyone in this room being called to a conference like this already knows this to some extent and wants to be part of building that tomorrow's land where there's still a space for humanity. Another resource that I would like to encourage you to look at is this book called Regenerative Enterprises. It again looks at how do we build, the subtitle of my talk, how do we build ecosystems of collaboration. One of the things that when I read this that really struck me is design for your own death. If you have an organization, don't assume that the most important thing is to keep your organization going. If you work in ecosystems of collaboration, it doesn't matter if you've served your purpose for 5 years, 10 years, and then you merge with another company or like with another player in the field, or you dissolve and all your skills feed other businesses. We very often create these organizations in good attempt, like Greenpeace or WWF, and then they become so massive that they become, to some extent, self-serving first, rather than continuing fully with their mission. So just keep this in mind, this flexibility that death is life's wonderful way to create plenty of life. Death is not so worrying, both on the personal level or the level of your company. So this is the book where all of this is kind of put together. Don't worry, you don't have to buy the book. It's on my Medium blog, and the blog is linked at the end, so you can just read it chapter by chapter, should you be interested. If you are interested, I also have a few copies. And again, there's a number of questions around how do we build stronger social innovation and community participation that are from my book, and the images I put in there just to, if you're not aware of Bali, which is a network in around the Philadelphia area in the States called the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. Do have a look at their work. It's a wonderful model, and anybody anywhere in Europe asking themselves, how could we translate what they did in the Philadelphia area to our region and network local businesses into this web of local living, of a local living economy. I would say that it will energize your work in your region. And coming to a close, Just a little anecdote. My colleague and CEO at Gaia Education, May East, once shared with me her daily practice in the morning. And for me, it was a key moment, because up to that point, I kind of got tired of the word activist, because it felt too much like fighting against something. There was always this, I'm an activist and I don't like this, and the banks are the baddies, or the government is the baddie. And so she told me that when she gets up in the morning, after her morning meditation, she asks herself, what is it that I want to activate with the power of my attention today? What story do I want to continue? And we all can make a big, big difference every day simply by asking ourselves that question. It's a redefinition of what activism is about. Where do we put the power of our personal attention? What kind of conversations do we have? Are we building tomorrow's land in a way that works for all, or are we just bickering about why things aren't working today? So I would encourage you to just keep that in mind and be mindful of how our stories, the stories we continue telling, the stories we change, really make a difference. And you can stay in touch with me. It's all on the PDF you'll get. And these images really to show that we're on a bifurcation point in this complex system that we're part of. We have the opportunity of building a more abundant world that works for all at the global scale, starting locally, but collaborating globally. And again, if anybody ever tells you, well, that's a great project, how do we scale it up? That's the wrong question. The right question is, how do we scale it out? Because bigger isn't better. Bigger very often destroys projects. But scaling out, saying, ooh, Bali did interesting things in the States. What can I take in terms of the DNA and the core ideas of what they did, and how can I make it relevant to the biocultural uniqueness of place? This is, in a nutshell, what working regeneratively is all about. You work with people in place, you get close to the story of that place, the essence of that place, and you create elegant solutions that are carefully adapted to the biocultural uniqueness of place. And I feel many of you are already doing this, and thank you for listening to me for half an hour. So.